So we're going to look at some of those examples in history today, but I want to continue with this question. What has evolutionary theory got to do with slavery or racism?
Well, when we think of evolution or Darwinism, we think of Charles Darwin. So what was Darwin's first book? It's
The Origin of Species.
And that's right, The Origin of Species. And I have a copy of Charles Darwin's book, and that's what you get if you buy it today, The Origin of Species. But that's not the full title, because the full title of this book is On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life.
It doesn't even say that on the book cover today.
Exactly, because that's a mouthful. But that doesn't really sound right in our society today, where we are so much against racism. But this idea of favored races was very much part of Charles Darwin's book. But in this book, he doesn't really talk about human origins. That came along in his second book, The Descent of Man. And when it comes to The Descent of Man, that's where Charles Darwin became extremely racist. And so what do I mean by that? In The Descent of Man, his second book, he talked about the non-white races as being less evolved. He called them savages more than 180 times. So why savages? Because in his mind, these are inferior stages of human evolution. They're not fully human. They're not civilized. So he calls them savage. So he was extremely racist. That is part of Charles Darwin's theory.
So these humans were less than the civilized people. They were backwards races. They were just not fit for they were weaker or older links of the evolutionary family of races.
Oh, they would even call them subhumans. In some cases.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's what he means by savage. Charles Darwin said that the Caucasians, the white race, will actually exterminate and eliminate all these non-white races over time. And of course, you may have heard of Stephen Jay Gould. So who's Stephen Jay Gould? He's maybe the leading evolutionist in the 1970s. He was a historian as well as a paleontologist. And Stephen Jay Gould said that racism was common before 1850s, but after Darwin wrote his book, it increased by orders of magnitude. So why did Stephen Jay Gould say that racism increased by orders of magnitude after Darwin wrote his book? Well, when did Darwin wrote his first book, The Origin of Species? It was in 1859. That was 26 years after slavery was already abolished in the British Empire, one generation. In the second book he wrote, The Descent of Man, that was 38 years after slavery was abolished in the British Empire and 6 years after the 13th Amendment in the United States. In other words, slavery was already abolished for more than one generation. Yet, racism increased by orders of magnitude after that. So in other words, think about it this way. If slavery was already abolished more than one generation before that, how can you pin slavery as the justification for racism? It's long gone. So when we look at history, history tells us that it's actually a belief in evolutionary theory that gave rise to the racism that we are so familiar with in the last century, like World War II, Hitler, and so on.
This has been a really rich conversation, and we've covered a lot, but I imagine that most of our listeners will have new questions and want to learn more. We would like to recommend to them one of our films. Would you like to tell them about it?
We have an award-winning documentary, Darwin, The Voyage That Shook the World. And in this documentary, we take you down Charles Darwin's trip on the Beagle to the Galapagos Islands. And we address things like mutation, speciation, natural selection. And we ask this question, if Charles Darwin was alive today, would he be a creationist or an evolutionist?
If you're interested in seeing the film, you'll find a link to it in the description. Joel Tay, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Joseph.